Life Audio.
I'm literally standing in this lobby feeling absolutely paralyzed. But this was a point where I had been practicing this little, the Lord is my shepherd. And one of the ways I would sometimes say it is, the Lord's my shepherd. Maybe this is going to turn out better than what my anxiety is predicting. I am not kidding you. Because I'd been practicing it a while, literally my brain came back online.
Welcome to the Faith Over Fear podcast, where we discuss powerful truths to quiet anxiety and fear, big and small. We are passionate about helping God's children discover, embrace, and experience His freedom. I would love to connect with you online or to speak at your next event. Visit our show notes to learn how to connect with me. I'm Jennifer Slattery, and I feel it's safe to say, based on the name and the focus of this podcast, that most, if not all of you, are seeking truths and tools that will help you experience less anxiety and a deeper sense of inner tranquility, inner calm. And I can relate to that. I hate that churning gut feeling that comes when worries flood my brain and chaos assaults me or those I love. But while in my most anxious moments, I long for someone to tell me that everything will be okay, I know true peace doesn't come from the absence of chaos, but instead from experiencing the Prince of Peace and holding tight to his truth in our greatest storms. And this is a topic my guest, Alan Fadling, knows well. Alan, thanks for joining us.
I'm glad to be able to join you. Thanks.
Alan Fadling is president and founder of Unhurried Living, Incorporated in Mission Viejo, California. He speaks and consults internationally with organizations such as Saddleback Church, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, Cru, Halftime Institute, Apprentice Institute, and Open Doors International. He is the award-winning author of An Unhurried Leader and An Unhurried Life, co-author with Jem Fadling of What Does Your Soul Love, and author of the book we're discussing today, A Non-Anxious Life, Experiencing the Peace of God's Presence. In this book, Alan, who once felt mastered by worry, brings counsel on how to learn a better way and who to look to for it. Jesus, the ultimate non-anxious presence. He constructs a posture from which we can rest more deeply, live more fully, and lead better. Fixing our minds on grace and eternity, we can begin to see the benefit of loosening our grip and operating from a sure foundation. Join Alan in releasing anxiety and taking up authentic love in a non-anxious life. Such a great invitation, Alan.
I'm glad it sounds inviting. It has been for me.
You mentioned in your blurb that there was a time when you felt completely mastered by worry. I would love, tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, I start the book telling a little bit of my personal history with anxiety, which begins with my own mom, who grows up in a post-World War II Midwestern orphanage. And if you grow up in an orphanage, you learn anxiety. I was her first son, and so this was our family way. I'm not blaming my mom for my worries. It's just my story. And so what I found is that sometimes anxiety drove me. It was like almost, I imagined it was fuel. Sometimes anxiety hindered me. And so it would just get in the way. I would feel. And then sometimes anxiety would even paralyze me. Would just feel absolutely stuck with the overwhelming thoughts and feelings and even physical sensations of anxiety. So, I don't write this book as a nice theological study. It was a personal quest, to be honest, as I wrote it.
And I know you and I were talking briefly before actually we started recording. The pandemic was very challenging for you, correct? And I think it was probably for everyone, but I know for you it was very challenging.
Yes, that's true. I proposed this book 2 weeks into the pandemic. And theoretically, it was a great next step. I had talked about hurry, Unhurried Life, Unhurried Leader. And the more I talked with people about hurry, the more I realized often it was anxiety that was energizing the hurry.
Wow.
So that's been my experience. And so I thought this is a perfectly good next step to take in writing. And then when the pandemic hit, some of us were thinking, how long is this going to last? A few weeks, maybe a couple months? No, longer than that. and radically changed our lives, all of us, I think. But, as someone who travels to speak, both domestically and internationally, my calendar died
Right.
in 2 weeks. My activities were done. Some revenue for our ministry was gone. And it was among, and continues to be really, these last 4 years have been among the most anxiety provoking years of my adult life.
Yeah, so many changes that occurred in such a short period of time. You mentioned in your book how, in your journey towards increased calm, how you sought help in numerous different ways, correct?
That's right. Yeah. So I mentioned in the book that I've been in therapeutic relationships all along the way for many decades. There have been seasons where that was really a critical, intensive sort of place of focus. I've done sort of some of the various forms of talk therapy that have been helpful to me. More recently, I took advantage of some of the more somatically focused therapies for anxiety, so more body focused than thought focused. And then here, a couple of years ago, anxiety got so noisy and depression got so strong that in conversation with my doctor, I decided to explore the possibility of medication. And for about a year, I took advantage of one of the popular anti-anxiety, anti-depression medications, and I needed it. It helped. And so, yeah, all of those have been really critical for me. So I didn't want to write a book that sort of said, well, if you just trust God, you'll never feel worried again. I don't know how that works. I don't know anybody for whom that works. It certainly hadn't worked for me.
That being said, that is not the focus of this particular book, correct? Like the
That's right.
medical aspect or the therapy aspect. You have a pretty narrow focus for this particular book.
Yeah, so what I wanted to do was I wanted to acknowledge that I needed help in many ways. But what I wanted to explore was this invitation from Jesus to come to him. Come to me, all you who are weary and who are burdened, and you'll find rest for your soul. Rest for your soul sounds like it would help with anxiety. Now, part of me sort of imagined, can I find my way to some plateau of peace where I never feel?
That would be so
Worried
nice.
again?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be a nice place?
Yes.
Boy, if you could find that place, you'd be making a lot of money. Right? But so what I found was actually, I did not find that place. What I found was it was possible to still experience anxious thoughts, the racing mind. And anxious emotion, which often shows itself in physical symptoms. It was possible for all of that to be present, but in some ways for Christ to be more present. One of the ways I talk about my own anxiety is that my anxiety is sort of what my cares look like when my awareness of God's care is thin.
Nice.
Like when my cares are huge and God's cares are way off on the horizon somewhere, or just a little teeny tiny inspirational thought. Well, then my cares overwhelm me. But when my cares are sort of cared for in the context of God's greater care, that has had a way of right-sizing my legitimate concerns and cares of life.
Early in the book, you mentioned how you've been learning to cultivate perspectives and habits of peace. And those two words together, cultivate and habit, it makes me think that for you, this has been something of a journey and a progressive journey towards peace. Is that true?
Yeah, that's a good way to say it. I think a lot of us really just want the magic bullet. Would you tell me the pill to take or the one-day seminar to attend that will bring me to the place where I never struggle with worry again? As I've said, I've not found that thing. What I have found is that there is a journey with the Prince of Peace that can bring us to places of deeper peace. So, for example, one little practice that has helped me a great deal. Very familiar line of scripture, whether or not you would describe yourself as a follower of Jesus or not. Most of us have heard a line from the Psalms that says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Yeah, if you've been to a funeral, you probably heard that line. But what I've found is that is a potent statement in the face of my worries. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. My anxiety says, you're on your own and you're going to want. So that little line from the Psalms has been something I turn to when something unpleasantly shocks me, when my emotions, my thoughts, my physical experience is overwhelmed with anxiety. I have found myself right in that moment, right in the teeth of that strong anxiety, reminding myself, okay, my anxiety is telling me one thing, But right here in the middle of that, the Lord is with me to shepherd me, to guide me, to care for me, to provide for me, to do all the things that anxiety is suggesting will not happen for me. And over time, you're right, over time, I'm gaining a new perspective. I can be the person who feels anxious, but doesn't worry frantically about my anxiety. That's a different sort of thing.
So dialing it down is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I think realizing that what I feel is not necessarily a statement of my current reality. It is what I'm feeling. It's real.
I like that. You also talk about upgrading your operating system. And now that I know you have so much therapy experience, which I think is beautiful, because I think that really helps your message to be safe to a lot of readers. And so when you talk about upgrading your operating system from anxiety to peace, is that a reference to the amygdala, to the emotional center in our brain at all? Did that go into that at all?
I would say it's in there. It's probably not a primary, but I recognize the dynamic of that. I've told a story. I don't know if it was in the book. I remember a time I'm in an airport. I'm in the lobby getting ready to clear security. I'm traveling to India. So I've had to get a visa and all of that stuff. And as I'm walking towards security, I realize I do not have my wallet.
Oh.
No wallet. I'm 20 minutes from, maybe 30 minutes from boarding. I am 30 minutes from home. I will not be getting my wallet, or I will not be taking this flight. And what happened was my brain just shut down. I became lizard boy, like just instincts is all I had access to. And I'm literally standing in this lobby feeling absolutely paralyzed. But this was a point where I had been practicing this little, the Lord is my shepherd. And one of the ways I would sometimes say it is, the Lord's my shepherd. Maybe this is going to turn out better than what my anxiety is predicting. I am not kidding you. Because I'd been practicing it a while, literally my brain came back online, like my creative thinking and my reasoning and all the things that I need to solve a problem like that. And in that moment, I was able to say, my wife is 10 minutes from the airport. I called her. Would you come back? Could I use your card for the next couple of weeks? I had my passport, or else there'd be no flight anyway because I needed the visa. But yes, the operating system thing is just a way of saying I've become so habituated to operating on the basis of my anxiety, as though it were my wonderful counselor, as though it has great advice for the next few steps I'll take. It's been good to downgrade that operating system, that way of operating, and explore what would it look like if peace were my operating system. And like I said, it's not a magic, hack. It is a process. It's a journey that I've been on.
I loved how you said because you'd been practicing this before that moment of crisis, you had the tools that you could kind of lean on. Just to our listeners, remind them that again, they're going to have to do the work, right, to get to the place that they want. In your book, you wrote, instead of accepting insecurity as my default, I've learned to assume confidence and resourcefulness as my foundation. So what do you mean by resourcefulness, if you could explain that a bit?
Yeah, I think what I was trying to say is that, again, I realize my anxiety is a kind of a scarcity vision of life. And so anxiety sort of says, you're going to be without. You're not going to have enough. You need to frantically do something so that the future is not the apocalypse that you're imagining maybe it is. Now, I'm being dramatic when I say that. But anxiety is a kind of scarcity mode. So what I've been seeking to do when I say the Lord's my shepherd, I shall not want, that's an abundance vision of my life. That in that airport without my wallet, I was not going to end up in a disaster. Somehow I was going to make my way. And as it turned out, I did. So this vision of living my life in the presence of a Prince of Peace gives me a broader vision of what anxiety wants to say. I've sometimes said my anxiety is kind of like a false prophet. It keeps giving me advice and it keeps being wrong. So often it has predicted things for the next 10 minutes or the next week or a month down the road. And man, they're dire predictions. And it's been wrong. The future was not as dire as it projected. That's been helpful for me. So that when I feel that strong rush of racing thoughts and physical sensations, I've come to realize I can often say, anxiety, thank you. I know you're trying to help, but we're not going with your suggestion. We're going to go a different way than that. One of my counselors used to say, Alan, you're going to have to learn to take your anxiety with you. You can't get rid of it.
Okay.
You're not going to just get rid of it. Learn to take it with you. Learn not to let it sit behind the driver's wheel. Let it sit in the back seat. How about that? So that's been a little bit of how that works for me.
Listening to you, you're very self-aware. And I'm curious to know, was that a process as well? You talked about how you started to recognize that anxiety was giving you bad advice, or that it maybe was driving the bus, or had kind of turned your rational thinking centers off. Was that kind of combined with sitting with God's presence that some of that revelation came, or is it over time, or both?
Yeah, that's a very helpful question. So what I think I would say is that a lot of the spiritual practices that have become regular in my life over time have in part borne the fruit of an awareness. Like I notice things instead of being autopiloted by things. And that's one of the great challenges for me in the past with anxiety was that it was just this mode. That's kind of what I meant by operating system. I mean, when we're sitting here looking at our computers, talking to each other on Zoom, I do not claim to understand the operating system underneath which all of this is happening. It's just there. And anxiety was sort of that way too. It was sort of this autopiloted, unaware, unawake sort of dynamic inside of me. So practices like silence or retreat or solitude, part of what those do, they're not so much ways of feeling calmer. Often it's just ways of noticing my anxiety, noticing dynamics inside of me, and then being able to bring those to God and say, I would like to not live this way. Could you show me a different way than this to live? And in that sense, Jesus as a Prince of Peace, that's been part of my vision, is that, well, if he's a Prince of Peace, surely he can show me a way forward navigating this anxiety that's so familiar.
I love that you said that. For maybe somebody who says, I'm trying to sit with Jesus and it's making me feel worse. That's not necessarily a bad thing, it sounds like, in the moment.
Right. Well, so yeah, because one of my strategies in dealing with anxiety is just to avoid it, to escape it, to numb myself in some way, to distract myself, because it does not feel good. To lean into those experiences. Here's one of the things I learned about my anxiety. Anxiety looks like this massive wall of China, insurmountable sort of reality. But what I've sometimes found, at least, and this is my experience, I'm not saying anyone else's is going to be the same, but it doesn't have a lot of endurance if you just sit with it for a bit.
Okay.
There was a time when dealing with panic, my counselor said, what might help you is to just sit with it. Don't keep fighting it, wrestling it like you were on a mat with it. Sit, face it, lean into it. It may just be adrenaline rushing through your body. And what would probably help you the most is for that to shut off and then to run through. So to me, that's been a connection that often my anxiety keeps going and stays strong because I'm fighting and wrestling and struggling, and it's almost like I'm giving it energy. Whereas when I practice just sitting with it, being in the presence of God, I feel it stronger, but I'm also giving my body a chance to do something God made it to do, which is to learn how to relax.
You did talk in your book about ways to numb and distract and all of that. Do you think some of that is because you had been so accustomed to shoving it down that when you quit doing that, it just felt so foreign to you?
Yeah, I think that's true. I had so many go-to ways of not feeling the anxiety that was so strong inside of me. So when I started leaning into it, I felt it. Numbing as a strategy for anxiety is only good for the season that you're numb. As soon as the numb wears off, whatever that is, then it's back. And numbness as a life strategy is probably not your best, move. Novocaine's great for dental work, but not for living.
Did that also, when you were living numb or numbing yourself to your anxiety, did that kind of bleed over into joy and some of your other life experiences?
Yeah, that's exactly right. You'd like to think you could just do a focused numbing on the anxiety only, but the problem is that kind of anesthesia is almost always general anesthesia. Sort of everything goes numb. And so, yeah, it impacted the way I was able to interact with my wife and my sons. It affected the degree to which I could be available to people, in my case, as a pastor for most of my adult life, being able to serve others and to help others. So the gift of leaning into my anxiety is having access to all of those other human realities that are part of living and relating and working.
You also mentioned you have learned to disregard anxiety's warnings. What do you mean by that?
So I used a little illustration. We've worked for nonprofits most of our lives. And early on, often what would happen is someone would donate, an old vehicle. They would never donate a brand new vehicle. That would have been nice, but that's not what happened. And then we would drive those vehicles often as, sort of missionary types. And they were often on their last legs. And we had one where the warning light just stayed on. We went to the mechanic. We said, can you fix this? He ran every test he could find. He said, if you're going to keep this car, you're going to have to learn to live with an engine light that's always on.
Okay.
And when I heard that, I thought, that sounds a little bit like my anxiety sometimes. It's like anxiety comes on like that red light on the dash and says, there's something wrong. But maybe what's wrong is the anxiety. It's just so there. It's always there. Everything's an anxious moment. And so what I mean by disregard anxiety is not pretend it's not there, not ignore it, certainly not numb or avoid or escape it, but put it in perspective. Maybe the message that it's bringing me is not as helpful as it thinks it is. I mean, and even the way I'm sort of talking about anxiety, like it was over here on the side instead of right in the middle of my chest or in my mind or in my physical body. That little bit of distance has been a helpful way of, again, sort of right-sizing its presence in my life, its impact on my life, the degree to which I'm going to let it make my next decision or not.
Do you go through that? You talk about mentally distancing yourself. Is there a way you go through that in your brain when you're feeling anxious? I mean, I know you've talked about some of the things, but do you cognitively think, okay, I'm going to kind of push it over to the side. I'm going to tell it to take a seat.
Yeah. So maybe one way I would describe it is, I think that happens in prayer for me. But prayer is one of those words where, what does that mean? Does that mean you say a lot of magical formulas in the direction of the divine? What's prayer? And by prayer, I just mean noticing that God's with me, trying to be responsive to the reality of God's presence. And so I've said, in some ways, my anxiety, the worry side of it, the active side of my anxiety is like practicing the absence of God, where prayer is sort of practicing the presence of God. Now, I don't mean when you feel anxious, you're purposely not remembering that God's with you. I'm talking about the worry side, the ruminating, the activity side of my anxiety has been a way of practicing the idea that God's not very close. So one of the things I'll do is if something happens, something happens in one of my son's lives, let's say, nothing like an adult son to make a parent worry. And so something happens in their life and now I feel concerned and now it's moving in the direction of worry. And I'm imagining my worry will do something for my son, which it has yet to actually do. But what I can then do is take that energy, take that feeling, take that concern, and I can bring it to God. And I can say, oh, God, I'm so glad you're with my son right now in another state where he lives. I'm so glad you care for him even more than I do. I'm so glad you have concerns for him and are at work in his life in a way that I could never do as his dad. And there's something about that kind of bringing my worries into the presence of God, not just, bringing my worries into the presence of God prayerfully has been a place of, again, putting my anxieties and worries into perspective.
I love that. You mentioned Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. Is there other places in Scripture that kind of your go-to when you're feeling, I don't know, maybe revved up or charged up?
Yeah. There are a couple of others that have meant a lot to me. Paul has a line in his letter to the Philippians that says, don't worry about anything, pray about everything. Now, that's in a sense what I was just describing a moment ago. I've sometimes heard pastors preach on that as though Paul was saying, you stop that worrying, you knock it off. Like it was just this harsh command. I think the spirit of it is much more like, you don't have to. You could instead, when something concerns you, you could bring that into the presence of a God who cares more than you can imagine about that which is now concerning you. So that's been one. The other one I talk about in a chapter is Jesus talks about anxiety. He says, don't worry about anything. Don't worry about what you'll wear, what you'll eat. Don't worry about tomorrow. And then he offers sort of this practical suggestion. He says, consider the birds. So I've taken that literally. I'm sitting here talking to you. I can look to my right, and we're raining right now here in California, and I can see the bird feeders outside my window, and I can see birds coming up. The other day, a month ago, we had 4 months of rain land in 2 days. It was flood level rain. I'm literally on a conversation just like you and I are having, and my phone is going off with a flood warning. If that won't provoke some anxiety, I don't know what will. And I look out my window and there are birds having lunch on my feeder. So literally, I will just watch birds. And for the most part, they seem to be relatively carefree. So I've kind of called them my mentors in a non-anxious way of existence. So that's been very, very practical for me, actually.
I love that. What's one thing you would maybe suggest to our listeners other than working through your book, which I think your book has some practical steps that they can follow to build that practice and that habit. But if you could say one thing you would encourage them to tuck in their pocket as we close?
Yeah, I think what I want to say is, one, anxiety is real. I'll speak as a pastor. I'm not going to preach the sermon that says you ought to knock that off. That doesn't help anybody. Nobody stops worrying by being harshly commanded to do so. Finding freedom from worry is something to which Jesus invites us. That's a very different spirit. And his invitation is a potent one. It is a powerful one, and it is a wise one. So it has helped me to think that Jesus as a Prince of Peace really could be alongside me as I navigate my way through experiences of anxiety. The only other thing I'll say is this particular book, I got a chance to narrate the audiobook.
Nice.
And I was very purposeful in seeking to read it in a non-anxious way. You can hear audiobooks in all kinds of spirits, right? The super excited narrator who's high energy. And imagine that narrator narrating this book. So I was very purposeful in narrating it in what I hoped was a calming, inviting sort of way. So if someone wants to get the book, they might find that the audiobook is a helpful way to engage it.
I love that. I also find it helpful that you are a pastor and you still struggle with anxiety. So for those who think like, if only I had more faith, or if only I was a better Christ follower or whatever, you debunked that. So thank you for that.
Well, of course, you're welcome. Yes. Turns out all of us pastors, whether we want to admit it or not, turn out to be human and have struggles and have needs. Some of us just are good at pretending that we don't.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this great conversation.
It was great to be with you. Thanks.
Well, thank you for listening. If you haven't already done so, I encourage you to subscribe to this podcast. Then you won't miss a single episode. Share it with your friends. And until next time, may you live as one who truly has been set free.